After years of being criticized for my pointless career, Dad said, "From now on, drinks are on my successful kid." The room went silent. My eyes watered. Not because he finally saw me, but because I'd spent years waiting for words I should have never needed to hear. The restaurant smelled like warmth and noise. That specific mix of roasted meat, perfume, and the faint tang of spilled wine that only existed in places meant to feel celebratory. Candlelight flickered across the polished surface of the table, where my family sat around like actors trying to remember their lines. My father was at the head, as always, his posture straight, his silver hair perfectly parted, his voice commanding even when he wasn't speaking. Like what you hear, hit like, spread the love by sharing, and subscribe so you never miss an update. It was supposed to be a birthday dinner. My mother's, technically. But no one was really celebrating her. They never did. It was just another excuse for everyone to orbit him. I remember swirling my drink, pretending to read the menu I'd memorized hours ago. My younger brother, Jason, was scrolling through his phone under the table. My mother smiled in that distant way she always did, a smile that existed mostly to keep peace. And then there was Dad, watching me as if waiting for the moment I'd say something worth judging. The waiter came by, and my father waved him off with a polite but dismissive gesture. "We'll order in a bit," he said, his tone soaked in control. That was how he lived, control as currency. And then, without warning, he laughed. A big, full laugh that turned heads from the next table. "Hey," he said suddenly, lifting his glass toward me. "From now on, drinks are on my successful kid." The words hung there, loud enough for everyone to hear. For the waiter, for my mother, for Jason, who looked up in confusion, and for me. I smiled automatically because that's what you do when someone congratulates you, but something inside me didn't move, didn't breathe. My eyes watered before I even realized they had, and I hated that it was happening. Hated that I still reacted like a child being given permission to exist. Everyone laughed. My mother clapped softly. Jason muttered, "Finally." And my father looked pleased with himself, as if he'd just gifted me the world. He didn't know that he'd just confirmed everything I'd been trying not to believe. I'd spent years waiting for words I should have never needed to hear. I took a sip of my drink, too fast, too desperate, and smiled wider to hide it. But the sound in my ears was different now, duller. Like someone had placed me behind a wall of glass, watching the rest of them live. That was the night I realized something inside me had broken long before that dinner, and that his approval didn't fix it. It only reminded me of the wound. Growing up, my father believed in hierarchy, not family. He was a man who measured love in achievement and achievement in money. He wasn't cruel in the way you could describe to others. He never yelled without reason, never hit, never called me names. But he was precise. His disapproval was surgical, the kind that could cut without leaving blood. When I told him at 17 that I wanted to be a writer, he smiled like I'd told him a joke. "That's cute," he said, "but what's the plan?" When I said that is the plan, he laughed. A real laugh, not mocking, but empty. "Son, dreams are fine," he said, "as long as they don't cost you your life." He didn't mean drugs or crime. He meant failure. In his world, the worst thing a person could be was average. I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the walls covered with scraps of stories I'd written. Little worlds I built because the real one felt too sharp. I tore half of them down. The rest stayed up out of stubbornness. But I never showed him my writing again. He worked in finance, which, in his mind, was synonymous with logic, success, and masculinity. My mother used to tell me he wasn't always that way, that once before Jason and I were born, he used to paint, that there were canvases hidden in the attic, rolled up and dust covered, from when he still believed beauty had value. I didn't believe her. I'd never seen that man. The one I knew measured life by numbers and status. So I grew up learning how to sound impressive without being honest. College, internships, jobs I didn't want but made him proud. And when I finally quit, when I walked away from a corporate marketing job to chase screenwriting full time, he didn't speak to me for 6 months. Not because he was angry, because he was disappointed. And in my family, disappointment was worse. It meant you'd fallen out of orbit. The restaurant faded out in my mind, and suddenly I was back in my apartment that night after the dinner. A small place, 2 rooms, a kitchen that hummed when the fridge kicked on, and a view of the city that looked better at night. The glass still had fingerprints from my hands. I'd come home drunk on something that wasn't alcohol. Maybe confusion, maybe grief. He'd called me successful. The word didn't fit. I'd sold one screenplay. Technically, an indie studio had optioned it. A low six-figure deal, sure, but it wasn't money that mattered. It was what came with it. The interviews, the photos, the validation that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy for believing in stories. But that night, the word successful sounded wrong, like a suit that didn't belong to me. Because success wasn't what I'd been chasing. It was him, his voice, his approval, his love wrapped in scarcity. I sat on the couch and thought about how many years I'd shaped myself around a ghost of what he wanted me to be, and how every time I achieved something, it felt less like victory and more like relief, the kind that lasted seconds before the next test came. I thought of the last time I'd seen him cry, only once when his father died. A man I barely remembered, but one he spoke about with a mix of resentment and awe. That's when I realized this was a cycle. He wasn't cruel because he wanted to be. He was cruel because he didn't know any other way to love. And yet, that understanding didn't make it easier. It made it worse. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You just become trapped inside it, aware of every repetition. 2 weeks after the dinner, my mother called. Her voice was soft, careful, the way someone speaks when they're holding a secret that isn't theirs to tell. "Your father's not feeling well," she said. "Just tired, don't worry." But I heard the hesitation in her breath, that half-second pause she always made when she was lying to protect him. I went to see him that weekend. His house, the same one I'd grown up in, felt smaller. Not because it was, but because I'd outgrown its silence. The walls still held the same photographs, the same trophies, the same oil painting of the mountain lake he'd bought because it looked professional. He was in his office, sitting in the leather chair that had once felt like a throne. But now he looked human, smaller somehow. "Hey, Dad." He looked up slowly. His eyes were tired. Not old, but tired. The kind of fatigue that came from fighting invisible battles. "Hey, kid," he said and smiled faintly. "You working on something new?" I nodded. "Yeah, trying to." "That's good." He coughed softly. "Keep busy. Keeps the mind sharp." It wasn't affection. It was habit. But I took it anyway. We talked about nothing for a while. About my car, about the weather, about Jason's promotion. Then, when I was about to leave, he said it. Quietly, like an afterthought. "I'm proud of you, you know." It should have meant everything, but it didn't. Because it wasn't now. It was too late. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship with words, and yet I smiled. "Thanks, Dad." He nodded, almost relieved. "Yeah." When I left, I saw my mother standing in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me the way someone looks at a wound they can't bandage. "He's trying," she said softly. "I know," I said. "So am I." But neither of us said the truth, that sometimes trying doesn't fix anything. Sometimes it just prolongs the quiet between two people who don't know how to speak love in the same language. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice in my head. "I'm proud of you." And underneath it, another voice, younger, my own, repeating every moment I'd waited to hear it. I realized something cruel. I'd spent half my life chasing a version of him that didn't exist anymore. Maybe never had. And in that realization was a kind of grief I didn't know how to name. The night after visiting him, I sat at my desk with my laptop open but untouched. The document blinked at me, the outline of a new screenplay I'd been trying to write for months. It was supposed to be about forgiveness, about a son returning home to reconcile with a father who never said, "I love you." At the time, I'd told myself it was fiction. But the truth was that I didn't know how to write about anything else. Every story I started found its way back to him, to that unhealed space between what I needed and what he gave. Outside, the city was quiet. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional siren, the flicker of streetlights through my blinds. I stared at the blank page until the lines blurred, then finally shut the laptop. I couldn't write about forgiveness, not yet. Instead, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Family gatherings, birthdays, holidays that looked happier in pictures than they'd ever felt. There was one photo, me at 12, holding a science fair ribbon. My father stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder, his smile sharp but performative. I remember that day vividly. I'd wanted to enter with a creative writing project, but he said, "There's no ribbon for imagination." So I built a volcano. It erupted perfectly, and he'd clapped the loudest. I learned something that day. Love, in our house, had conditions. 2 weeks passed. Mom called again. Her voice was thinner this time. "He's been coughing more. The doctor's running tests. It's probably just age catching up." But she didn't believe it, and neither did I. I drove down that weekend, through rain that turned the highway into glass. The closer I got to home, the heavier the sky felt, like the weather itself was bracing for something. When I walked in, the house smelled like antiseptic and lemon cleaner, an attempt to mask something fragile. He was in the living room this time, wearing an old sweater I didn't recognize. The TV was on low, a baseball game he wasn't really watching. "Hey, Dad," I said. He looked up, smiled faintly. "Hey, big shot. Working hard?" "Trying to." "That's good. Keep trying." It was our ritual. Small talk as armor, neither of us daring to touch the truth. He looked weaker. His hands shook when he lifted his cup. His voice wavered slightly, but his pride was still intact. That was the cruelest part. He'd rather die standing than admit he was falling. I sat with him, watching the game in silence. The air between us was heavy with everything unsaid. After a while, he spoke. Quietly, eyes still on the screen. "You ever think about what people remember about you when you're gone?" I froze. "Sometimes," I said. He nodded. "I do, lately." A pause. The sound of the commentators murmuring through static. "I think people remember the wrong things," he said. "The big moments, the speeches, the wins. But that's not who you are. It's what you performed." It was the closest he'd ever come to self-awareness. "Is that how you feel?" I asked. He smiled without looking at me. "Maybe." Then he coughed again, deep, shaking, the kind that didn't sound like a cold anymore. I wanted to ask what the doctors had said, but I didn't. Because if he didn't say it, maybe it wasn't real yet. Later in the kitchen, Mom leaned against the counter, her eyes red-rimmed, but composed. "He's sicker than he lets on," she whispered. "The scans showed something in his lungs. They're still running tests." "How bad?" She hesitated. "Bad enough." She looked at me, and I saw in her face years of quiet endurance, of being the bridge between his silence and our pain. "Does he know?" I asked. She nodded. "He knows. He just doesn't want to talk about it." That was him, all the way to the end, refusing to name the things that scared him. I drove back that night with my chest tight, headlights slicing through the dark. I replayed his words over and over. People remember the wrong things. What would I remember about him? The way he never said, "I'm sorry"? The way he made me believe love had to be earned? Or the small, fleeting moments? The nights he'd sit on the porch, smoking quietly, his eyes somewhere far away, that hinted at the man he might have been before the world hardened him? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was its own kind of grief. Over the next few months, I visited more often. Sometimes just for an hour, sometimes to bring groceries or sit in silence while he watched TV. He never asked for help, but I could see the decline, the tremor in his hands, the cough that lingered, the weight he was losing. One afternoon, I found him in his study, staring at an open drawer. Inside were old photos. My childhood, Jason's, family vacations we'd taken before everything turned into quiet competition. He picked one up and smiled faintly. "You remember this?" It was me, maybe 8 or 9, sitting on his shoulders at the beach. my hair wild, his face sunburned. He looked happy, not proud. Happy. I remember, I said. He nodded slowly, still looking at the photo. I wasn't a very good dad, was I? The question hit harder than I expected. Not because of what he said, but because he finally said it. I swallowed. You tried? He smiled sadly. That's what people say when the truth hurts too much. There was silence again. Then softly he said, I wanted you to be better than me. I know, I said. No. He shook his head. You don't. I wanted you to be safe from disappointment. That's all I ever wanted, but I didn't realize that was the disappointment. I didn't know what to say. My throat ached with everything I'd never told him. How many nights I'd sat awake wondering why I was never enough. How much of my life had been spent trying to fill the silence he left behind. He put the photo down and looked at me. You turned out fine. Better than fine. I nodded, but tears blurred the words. It's strange. The moments you think will define you don't. It's the quiet ones when the person you've spent your life trying to understand finally speaks truth, and you realize you're not angry anymore. Just tired. A month later, the hospital calls started. It wasn't a surprise, but knowing something's coming doesn't make it hurt less when it arrives. Mom called one morning, her voice trembling. They're admitting him. He collapsed last night. It's in his lungs, and it's spreading. When I got there, the air in the hospital was sharp and sterile. Machines beeped rhythmically like heartbeats counting down. He was asleep when I entered. Thinner, smaller, almost unrecognizable. Tubes snaked around him, monitors blinking. I sat beside the bed, unsure whether to speak. Then he opened his eyes slowly. Hey, kid. Hey, Dad. He smiled weakly. Don't look so serious. I'm fine. You're in a hospital. Temporary inconvenience, he whispered, then winced as he tried to laugh. I sat there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, thinking about all the years we'd wasted on pride. He looked at me for a long time, then said something I didn't expect. Do you know where I put the key? I frowned. What key? For the attic. The attic? He nodded. There's a box up there. Been sitting for years. Take it when I'm gone. You'll understand. I wanted to ask more, but the nurse entered, adjusting his IV, and the moment passed. I left that night with those words echoing in my mind. You'll understand. I didn't know what he meant then, but I would, and it would change everything. In the days that followed, I stayed at the house with Mom. Jason came by occasionally, but he had his own family, his own life, his own way of avoiding discomfort. Every morning, I'd drive to the hospital, sit beside Dad, and read to him. Old books, essays, even pages from my unfinished screenplay. He listened quietly, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes drifting off mid-sentence. One afternoon, as I read a passage about regret, he whispered, Don't let it eat you. What? I asked. Regret, he said softly. It's worse than pain. Pain fades. Regret just finds new ways to hurt. I wanted to tell him I already knew that I'd lived with it my whole life, but instead, I just nodded and kept reading. Because some truths don't need answers. They just need witnesses. The day he died, it rained again. The same kind of quiet, steady rain that blurred everything outside into watercolor. Mom was there, Jason too. But it felt like the room belonged to him and me. He looked peaceful, almost like he was already half gone. He reached for my hand. His skin was cold. You did good, kid, he whispered. Better than I ever did. My throat closed. Dad. But he shook his head faintly. Don't waste it. The time. Don't wait for the words. They never come soon enough. And then, before I could say anything else, he exhaled one last time. Just like that, he was gone. And in that silence, that perfect, unbearable silence, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't want his approval. I just wanted him back. That night, I went into the attic. The air was thick with dust and memory. The bulb flickered weakly. I found the box easily. Wooden, worn, with his handwriting on the lid. Inside were old photos, letters, and at the very bottom, a sketchbook. I opened it and froze. Page after page of paintings, sketches of me, of our family, of moments I didn't even remember. My first day of school, the beach, my graduation. He'd been painting all along, secretly, quietly. Each drawing was a version of love he never knew how to say out loud. And on the last page, a note. For my son, the storyteller. You taught me what words couldn't. My hands shook. My vision blurred. I sat there for hours, surrounded by the echo of everything I'd spent years trying to find, realizing it had been here all along, waiting for me to understand. And in that attic, beneath the rain's soft percussion, I cried for the father I'd finally met too late. Grief isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or arrive with grand gestures. It seeps in quietly, through the small moments you don't expect. For me, it was the silence, the kind that filled the house after the funeral, when everyone had gone home and the only sound left was the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mother sat at the kitchen table, tracing the edge of her teacup. I sat across from her, staring at the untouched food we'd ordered hours ago. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The absence was speaking for us. When people die, they don't take their presence with them. They take the weight of everything you never said. That night, I went back to the attic. The air was still, but different somehow. The kind of stillness that felt like someone had just left the room. The box was where I'd left it, open, its contents spilling out like pieces of a life that had been hiding in plain sight. I took out the sketchbook again, flipping through the pages slower this time. Each one felt heavier, like it carried something sacred. There was one sketch that stopped me, a drawing of me sitting at my desk, probably high school age, writing in a notebook. He'd drawn it from memory, but it was so detailed I could almost feel his eyes on me in that moment, watching without interrupting. In the corner of the page, faint pencil marks. You were never invisible. I just didn't know how to look. I sat on the attic floor, holding that sketch, and for the first time since the funeral, I cried without restraint. The kind of crying that doesn't come from sadness alone, but from the realization that love had always been there, just buried under pride and fear. He'd loved me the only way he knew how, by watching, by preserving, by recording my life in silence. And I had spent years mistaking that silence for indifference. I stayed up there until morning, surrounded by his secret art, the proof that he'd been trying to speak through something I hadn't known to listen for. When the sun rose, pale and cold through the attic window, I knew I couldn't leave it there. I needed to understand him. Not the man I'd grown up with, but the one who'd lived quietly in those sketches. Over the next few days, I went through everything in that box. Letters to himself, notes scribbled in margins, quotes from books I'd never seen him read. One, written on the back of a bill receipt, said, "Success is loud, love isn't." I wish I'd known that sooner. Another, I wanted to give my son certainty, but certainty kills curiosity, and he was born to wonder. It felt like reading a man who had been trying to rewrite his own story, too late to publish it. Each page peeled back another layer of him. The artist, the dreamer, the man who had once believed in beauty, before life convinced him it was impractical. And as I pieced together his private world, I started seeing him differently. Not as the villain of my childhood, but as another flawed protagonist, trapped in the same cycle I'd spent years trying to escape. It terrified me how much of him I recognized in myself. The perfectionism, the silence, the way I pushed people away when I was scared they'd see through me. Maybe that's why his approval had mattered so much, and because it wasn't just validation I wanted, it was recognition. I wanted to believe we weren't so different. A week after the funeral, Mom found me sitting in his study. The room still smelled faintly of him, old cologne, leather, and dust. His desk was cluttered with papers, pens, and unfinished crossword. "You've been quiet," she said, leaning on the doorframe. "Just thinking." She nodded. He'd like that, you thinking. I smiled faintly. "Did you know about the paintings?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Some of them, not all." "Why didn't he ever show them?" She sighed, walking over to the desk. "Because he didn't think they were good enough. He said painting made him feel foolish. Foolish. Yes. She looked at me. He grew up being told art was a luxury, that real men built things, they didn't dream them. So he buried it. And when you started writing, she trailed off. I waited. I think he saw himself in you. And it scared him. Her words hit like a slow ache, the kind that doesn't fade, just shifts deeper inside. So he tried to protect me from becoming him, I said quietly. She nodded. Exactly. But in doing that, he became everything he feared his father had been: cold, distant, unreachable. I swallowed hard, and I became what he feared most. She touched my shoulder gently. You became what he wished he could have been. That night, I opened my laptop again. The screenplay document was still there, half finished, untitled. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat, but this time the story felt different. I started writing, not about a father and son, but about two men who'd spent their lives trying to understand each other through silence. About how love can hide inside anger. About how sometimes forgiveness isn't something you give, it's something you discover, buried under all the things you thought were broken. The words came easier than they ever had, maybe because they weren't mine alone anymore. Every line I wrote felt like a conversation with him, one we never had while he was alive, but one we were finally having now. It wasn't catharsis, it was communion. A few weeks later, I got a call from my agent. A producer had read my old script, the one that had been optioned before. They wanted to move forward with it. They were ready to shoot. He was talking fast, excited, listing details, contracts, casting, production dates. But my mind was elsewhere. He said, "This is your big break, man. You made it." I thanked him, hung up, and sat there staring at my father's photo on the shelf. You made it. The same words he'd used that night at the restaurant. From now on, drinks are on my successful kid. But now the word successful meant something different. It didn't feel hollow anymore. It didn't belong to him or the world. It belonged to me. Because success wasn't about his approval, it was about finally understanding the person who couldn't give it. And in that understanding, I felt something like peace. Months passed. The movie premiered at a small festival. People clapped. Critics wrote things. My name appeared on screens. But the real moment, the one that mattered, came quietly afterward. I'd arranged for a small exhibit to be set up in the lobby. My father's paintings, restored and framed. His work, finally seen. There was a small crowd gathered around them, strangers admiring the colors, the tenderness, the human touch that had lived unseen in the attic all those years. I stood in the back, watching them watch him. Mom was beside me, holding my arm. He would have hated this, she said softly, smiling. Yeah, I said, but he would have stayed until everyone left. She laughed, that quiet, knowing laugh that only comes from shared pain. We stood there in silence, surrounded by his art, his ghost, his redemption. And for a brief, impossible moment, I felt like he was there too, standing just behind me, proud in his own quiet way. When I got home that night, I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept his sketchbook. There was one last page I hadn't noticed before. It was blank, except for a single line written across the top. If you ever find this, finish the story. I closed my eyes and smiled through tears. I am, I whispered. I'm still finishing it. And maybe that's what grief really is. Not the end of something, but the continuation of a story you write together, even after one of you stops speaking. I thought that would be the end. But life has a way of unearthing one more truth when you think you've already heard them all. A few weeks later, Mom called again. Her voice sounded lighter, almost hesitant. I found something, she said. In his desk. I think it's for you. When I got there, she handed me an envelope, yellowed, sealed. My name written in his handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a letter. His last one. Son, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I won't say I'm sorry, because I know that word doesn't erase the years between us, but I need you to know something. You were never the disappointment. You were the proof that I was wrong. About success, about strength, about what matters. I spent my life trying to build something solid, but you built something real. Stories last longer than any bank account. Don't stop creating. Don't let fear turn you into me. And if you ever doubt yourself, just remember I saw you, even when I couldn't say it. Love, Dad. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. For the first time in my life, his words didn't sound like judgment. They sounded like love, the kind that doesn't need to be earned, the kind that lingers long after the person is gone. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside the sketchbook, and sat in silence, letting the weight of it all settle into something warm. He'd finally spoken the language I'd spent my life learning to understand, and I realized maybe we'd been speaking the same one all along, just on different frequencies. There's something about the quiet after loss that feels almost sacred. Not peaceful, just still. Like the world pauses to let you breathe differently, softer, as if afraid to break whatever fragile thing you're holding. For weeks after reading that letter, I moved through life in a kind of half dream. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit by the window, and reread his words like scripture. Each time they meant something new. Don't let fear turn you into me. It echoed in my head every time I hesitated to start something, every time I questioned if my work was worth doing, if my voice was worth hearing. The truth is, fear doesn't die with the people who gave it to you. It just changes form. It becomes quieter, more cunning. But so does courage. And somewhere between those two, I started to find myself again. My mother decided to sell the house that spring. It made sense. Too many rooms, too many ghosts. I helped her pack, moving through each space like I was cataloging memories. His study, the porch, the attic. Every corner of that house carried a version of him. Not the man he was, but the man he might have been. When we reached the attic, I thought I was ready. But opening that hatch felt like stepping into a past that still breathed. Dust motes floated in sunlight like slow, falling time. The paintings were still there, framed now, labeled for the exhibit. I touched the edge of one, tracing the dried ridges of his brushstrokes. It felt like touching his hand again. Mom watched me quietly. You know, she said, I think he started painting again because of you. I looked up. Because of me? She nodded. After you left for college, he'd go up here late at night. I asked him once what he was working on. He said, learning how to say things differently. That hit harder than I wanted it to, because that's all I'd ever been trying to do too. To say things differently, to turn silence into language. Maybe love was just that, the attempt to say something we've never had words for. When the house finally sold, Mom moved into a small place by the water. I visited often. We'd walk along the pier at sunset, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, she handed me a small box. Found this behind his desk, she said. Figured it's yours now. Inside were film negatives, dozens of them. I held them up to the light and realized what they were. Reference photos for his paintings. But not all of them were of me or the family. Some were of strangers. Street corners, a park bench, a man sitting alone by a lake. I developed them over the next few weeks one by one, until my wall was covered with tiny windows into his secret life. And that's when I saw it, a pattern. Every photo he'd taken, every painting he'd done, was of someone alone. Never groups, never crowds, always solitude. It wasn't vanity, it was confession. He'd been painting his loneliness. The realization hit me like a slow, sinking wave. All those years he'd seemed distant, critical, unreachable. Maybe it wasn't pride, maybe it was fear. Maybe he was terrified that if he let anyone too close, they'd see how empty he really felt. And maybe I'd inherited that too. That night, I sat in my studio, my own space now, filled with notes and storyboards and the quiet hum of creative chaos. On my desk, I placed one of his photos, the man sitting alone by the lake. I stared at it until my eyes stung, and then I began to write. Not a screenplay this time, not fiction, a memoir about him, about us, about what it means to love someone who never learned how to show it. I wrote for hours, maybe days. The words poured out like water from a cracked dam. I didn't worry about structure or audience or marketability. I just wrote. For him, for me, for every person who's ever waited too long to be seen. And when I finally stopped, when the last sentence appeared on the page, I realized something. I wasn't writing about grief anymore. I was writing about inheritance. Not the kind that comes in wills or bank accounts, but the kind that lives in how we carry each other's unfinished stories. Months later, I sat at his grave for the first time since the funeral. The grass had grown in. The stone was simple. His name, his dates, a small engraving of a mountain lake. I smiled when I saw that. He'd chosen it himself, apparently. The same image he'd once said looked professional. I sat there for a while, watching the light fade across the sky. I finished the story, I said quietly, the one you started. The wind moved through the trees like a breath, a soft rustling sound, almost like a reply. I think you'd like it, I added. It's messy, complicated, a little too honest, but it's real. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was talking to a ghost. I felt like I was talking to a man who'd finally learned how to listen. The memoir was published the following winter, small press, modest release, nothing glamorous. But it found its way into people's hands. Letters started coming in, from sons, daughters, parents, all saying the same thing. I thought I was the only one. That's when I understood what he meant in his letter, about stories lasting longer than bank accounts. He was right. Stories are what remain when everything else fades. A few months after the book came out, I was invited to speak at a university, a seminar on creative authenticity. I almost declined. Talking about myself felt strange, indulgent, but something in me wanted to go. The lecture hall was packed. Students, faculty, young artists with bright eyes and shaky confidence. I told them about failure, about waiting too long for someone's approval, about learning to write from scars instead of from pride. And at the end, during the Q&A, a student asked, "How do you know when your work is enough?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "You don't," I said. "You just reach a point where you stop asking for permission to believe it." Afterward, as I packed my notes, I noticed a young man lingering near the front row. He waited until everyone else had left before coming up to me. "My dad never understood what I wanted to do either," he said quietly. "I almost quit. Your story helped me not to." He handed me a folded piece of paper, a sketch of his father, drawn in rough pencil lines. "I think he was just scared too," the boy said, eyes glistening. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Then you already understand him better than he ever did himself." As he left, I realized something simple but enormous. The story I thought was about my father had become something bigger. It was about all of us. All the ways we try to earn love that was ours to begin with. That night, I returned home and sat by the window again. The city lights flickered like distant thoughts. On the table beside me sat the letter, now worn at the edges. I opened it one last time, tracing the handwriting I'd memorized. "Don't let fear turn you into me." I smiled softly. "I won't," I whispered. Then I looked around the room, the photos, the sketches, the framed painting of the lake that now hung above my desk, and realized he hadn't failed me after all. He'd just taught me the long way around what love really is. Not words, not pride, not approval. Presence. And presence doesn't end when the person does, it just changes shape. Years later, I'd visit that same restaurant, the one where he'd raised his glass and said, "From now on, drinks are on my successful kid." It was different now. Renovated, brighter, full of strangers who didn't know the weight that room once held. I sat at a corner table, ordered his favorite whiskey, and raised my glass quietly. "To the man who never knew how to say it," I murmured. "And the son who finally heard it anyway." The waiter walked by, smiling politely. "Celebrating something?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," I said softly. "A story that finally found its ending." And as I took that first sip, the world felt still again. Not empty this time, but full. Full of echoes, full of understanding, full of everything that had once been missing. Because some words, even when they come too late, still manage to arrive exactly when they're meant to. In the years that followed, I never stopped writing. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because writing had become the way I kept him alive. Every story, every scene, every flawed father and frightened son I wrote carried a trace of him. And maybe that's how love survives. Not as something we finish, but as something we continue. A dialogue that outlives both voices. Sometimes I still dream about him. Not as the man from my childhood, stern, distant, unyielding, but as the version from his sketches. The one smiling quietly, paint on his hands, eyes softer. In the dream, he's painting by the lake. He looks up at me, nods once, and says, "You finished it." And I wake up knowing he's right. Because I did. We did. Together. It's been almost 10 years since that night at the restaurant. The toast that began everything and ended it all at once. Life has changed in ways I never expected. My work found its rhythm, my voice, its purpose. The memoir led to films. The films led to new stories, and those stories brought me back to myself. But no matter how many audiences I stand before, how many hands I shake, I still find myself thinking about him when the lights go down. Last month, the local museum hosted an exhibit, Echoes of the Ordinary. It featured artists who found beauty in small things, half-lit windows, empty chairs, forgotten streets. One section stopped me cold. There, under a spotlight, hung a painting I hadn't seen before. The brushwork was unmistakable, his. The title read, Unfinished Conversation. The image was simple. Two chairs facing a lake, one slightly turned toward the other. The light in it was softer than anything he'd painted before. The curator approached quietly. "It was donated anonymously, she said. "No record of where it came from." I stood there for a long time, staring. It wasn't the mystery that moved me. It was the message, the quiet implication that maybe some things never stay buried. Maybe they find their way back to the people meant to see them. As I left the museum, dusk had settled over the city. The air smelled faintly of rain and old wood, like home. I walked along the street, my reflection flickering in the windows, until I reached the cafe I used to write in during those years of trying. I sat by the window, opened my notebook, and began a new story. Not about grief, not about loss, about continuation. Halfway through, I paused and looked outside. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw him, sitting at a table across the street, head bowed, sketchbook open. A ghost or memory or something in between. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled. Just once. Then the light changed, the reflection shifted, and he was gone. I didn't chase it. I just smiled back softly. Because some stories don't end. They simply find quieter ways to keep speaking. I closed the notebook and whispered, "Thank you." And as I walked home through the hum of evening traffic, the city lights blinked like distant stars. Not watching, but waiting. Waiting for the next story to begin. Have you ever waited for words that shouldn't have been necessary to hear? Have you ever mistaken silence for indifference, only to discover later it was love in disguise? What do we inherit from the people who hurt us, their wounds or their wishes? And when forgiveness finally comes, is it for them or for the version of ourselves we lost while waiting to be seen?